do we want to start our first panel, or we want to show our first video?
Yeah, so let's get the first video pulled up. We're going to hear from Dr. Carrie Knott, the director of the UKREC, to talk a little bit about our wheat crop conditions.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Wheat Talk in lieu of the Wheat Field Day. I'm Carrie Knott. I'm the Small Grains Extension Agronomist here at the University of Kentucky Research and Education Center in Princeton. We thought we'd kick off this program with just a very brief update on crop condition for wheat in Kentucky. And overall, what I'm hearing from agents, producers, and also what I'm seeing myself throughout the state is a pretty good condition for our wheat crop. In general, most of the wheat that was planted in a timely manner, so October timeframe, had plenty of time to develop a very strong tiller system, and now has some very good yield potential based upon what I'm seeing. For producers that may have been delayed in their planting and were closer to November, and in some of my trials I even put out some December planting dates, those look pretty thin, and that has to do with how cold we got. And so later into the fall, and of course, this winter we had a pretty cold winter, and that negatively affected any sort of tillering capabilities that those plants had. And so some of those planting dates, even the December planting date on certain soil types here in Princeton, actually have no stands established at all. It was a complete loss. Other field conditions had thin stands, and we'll go ahead and harvest them, but they're not going to be any bumper crops at all. Overall, I'm optimistic that the rest of the season will be quite good growing conditions for wheat. This week, and yesterday actually, when I was recording this video, was quite cool. And you know, the nights with quite cool temperatures in the 40s or so are very good growing conditions for wheat. And so I'm very optimistic we're going to have an excellent grain field period that's going to result in excellent yields. And given these prices, boy, if they hold, we will have some excellent profitability options. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. And if you have any questions, please reach out to any of us. Thank you.
All right, well, I think we had a little bit of a technical difficulty to get started there. So I'm going to welcome you again to this morning's Wheat Talk webinar. This morning, we're going to be moderated by the host of the Dirt to Dollars podcast. That includes myself, Matt Adams, Hardin County Extension Agent for Agriculture, Whitney Carman, Grayson County Extension Agent for Agriculture, and Daniel Carpenter, LaRue County Extension Agent for Agriculture. If you're not familiar with our show, if you haven't heard about the Dirt to Dollars podcast, we like to say that it's a show where we talk everything agriculture. And we have a new episode out every week. You can find us basically just wherever you find podcasts. And we may talk a little bit more about that later on in the day. But it's just a great day to talk about wheat. We have a really good wheat crop growing out there. I think we had some really good crop conditions that came out this morning across the statewide. We've got harvest delivery wheat prices north of $7. So all the bankers and the economists are even happy, and we're ready to talk about wheat. So, Whitney, I think you have a poll to tell us about.
Yes. And so while you are looking at this poll, which basically we want to hear from you, what are you out there doing? Are you a producer, are you a crop consultant? Are you an extension agent listening today? Please fill out that poll because we do use that throughout this program. The other thing I want to explain to folks is the way this webinar is going to work. For those that didn't get to hear a few minutes ago, this is going to be moderated by us, and we are going to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen to ask questions to our panelists. And so what we want to do is you all type in questions that you have for them. We will ask those. And if you find a question that's been written and you agree or want that question answered, then you need to raise your hand or put the thumbs up on it, because that will get moved to the top of the list. And so we expect lots of questions. So if you want that one particularly answered, make sure you give that a thumbs up. And so with that being said, do we have any other? I think we got all of our housekeeping taken care of, and I'm going to end the poll. So get it in there. I've got like 10 seconds left. We're going to go ahead and roll with our first panel today, which is, we've got a lot of great specialists here for you guys to chat with today. And the first one's going to be an IPM focus. And so we've got with us today, Dr. Carl Bradley. He is the extension plant pathologist here at Princeton. We have Dr. Travis Legleiter. He is the extension weed specialist. Dr. Tim Strombaugh, he's with Biosystems and Ag Engineering and doing a lot of work with the specialist here. Dr. Raul Villanueva, he is our extension entomologist, and Dr. Jordan Shockley, he's with Ag Econ. So thanks guys for joining us. We're really glad you could be with us today. All right.
So it doesn't look like we have too many questions coming in yet. So Dr. Bradley, we'll start with you. Obviously, it's a little dry this week, but with the wet weather we've been experiencing recently, might be difficult for a lot of our farmers to spray fungicides on their wheat fields for Fusarium head blight management. How wide is the window for fungicide application for Fusarium head blight management?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. That's a great question. So typically the timing we want to shoot for management of Fusarium head blight or scab, we sometimes call the disease scab, with fungicides, is to try to spray right whenever the heads are beginning to flower or going through anthesis. We call that the Feeks growth stage 10.5.1. And that's when you can see those little anthers just coming out of the middle part of the head, and then they'll continue to come out. So that's sort of like what we consider the perfect timing. But as you mentioned, because of all the rain, it can be hard to get a ground sprayer through the field just because of the conditions, the muddy conditions, which, by the way, the rain is also really good for the disease. So it is critically important to try to get something sprayed on there. So the window is really a little bit wider than just that Feeks 10.5.1. And some of the research that I've been a part of has been some multi-state research, a lot of different states involved, looking at some different timings. And we found that if you're going to miss that perfect timing, it's better to miss it just a little bit late than on the early side. And we've seen up to about 6 to 7 days after that Feeks 10.5.1 timing can still give you pretty adequate control, pretty similar to applying at that Feeks 10.5.1. A couple things needed to pay attention to are the labels on all of these. There is a limit to how late you can spray, so always be sure you're reading the labels on that. And they differ a little bit by product. Some products give you just a pre-harvest interval, and I think a lot of times that's around 30 days. But again, labels can change, so be sure you're reading those labels. At least one of the products that's available gives an actual growth stage. I think that's 10.5.4, which is kernel watery ripe, I think is what that is, but you might want to double check that too. So yeah, the window is actually a little bit wider, and it looks like this week, it seems like they've taken some of the rain out of the forecast for now. And so it might be a good time to go out and try to spray this week. Hopefully those soils will dry up a little bit and allow that to happen.
Just a quick follow-up question to that. I know you've worked a lot with the product Miravis Ace and some of the timing with that product. It's supposed to have a little bit, they claim, a little wider application window. Even what have you seen in your plots with that product?
Yeah, good question. The question about Miravis Ace, new product, and it came out a couple of years ago, so it's relatively new. When it first came out, it was spray on earlier, actually Feeks 10.3, which is when it emerged. Trials here at the University of Kentucky, so trials across lots of different states, lots of different classes of wheat, etc. That even though that timing will give you pretty good control of the disease, it doesn't give as good of control of the toxin that this pathogen produces. We call that deoxynivalenol, or DON, D-O-N for short. Some people call it vomitoxin, and that's where you'll get dinged at the elevator, because they'll test for that. And if you are above 2 parts per million, you will probably get dinged for it. So that's most important. So what we found really, Matt, is that playing on the early side is maybe not going to give you as good of DON control. And so it would be better still, from our research, to apply at that Feeks 10.5.1 or just a little bit later.
So yeah, still need to stay on top of that when you're scouting and make sure you're out there at the right time. So we'll just move on down the line of straw bales here to Dr. Stumbaugh. The next question I think is for you. When we're spraying this wheat, how critical is nozzle selection and getting good coverage?
Yeah, the nozzle selection is very critical. And, you know, the first thing, and Dr. Bradley just mentioned that, always go back to the label and understand what the label wants, particularly for droplet size, as well as flow rate and all that, and then know what pressures and speeds that you're going to be running. So all that has to be tied together in terms of getting the right nozzle, getting the right droplet size to minimize drift, but still have good effective coverage of what's going on with that. The other thing that Dr. Bradley and I have looked at the last couple of years is some different nozzle types, especially as done fast, you know, that narrow window to get across. And what happens if you've got that weed head sprayer, you think about that spray pattern coming straight down. As that machine's moving, the spray is actually moving relative to the ground. And so what happens is you get those droplets hitting one side of that weed head. And so what we've been looking at is any kind of nozzle pattern that has a V pattern on it so that it sprays forward and sprays backwards. And what that's going to do is as you go across that weed head is going to help you to get some coverage coming back on the back side of that weed head to get coverage. And we actually found that even tilting that a little bit as well. So tilting that spray nozzle backwards so that that back side of that V pattern is really spraying way back. So as that machine's moving forward, we're really trying to get on the back side of that weed head, get coverage all around it. And we've seen a fairly significant amount of coverage there. But anything you can do to help you get that spray on all around that, covered all over the place, efficacy, best control of the disease.
And along that same line, you talking about what types of coverage and what nozzle selection. Is there any sort of maintenance reminders you can give to producers as far as trying to get good pesticide coverage on your sprayers?
One of the big things I always preach every time is preach coming out of those nozzles, and those nozzles, sometimes we will, years they've always worked and we don't check them, and it's really worth some time. And that's a good over the winter kind of activity, is to get on that boom and look at those nozzles, make sure they're in good shape, make sure the patterns look even, you don't have hard streams coming to different points in the pattern. Look at the flow rate one relative to another, and that's where an investment in some of these calibrators that you can stick underneath the nozzle real quick, you can get down the boom pretty quick and see that the flow rate is the same on each one of those. And that's really critical to make sure you got that even coverage across the boom, all the droplet sizes that are in the range that you want them to be to have the best efficacy.
Is there any kind of, timeline or acreage level or anything that we need to look at how long can we get away with running these nozzles before we need to look at checking them or replacing them?
That's a really tough question, because those nozzles, it depends. There's so many different manufacturers. There's so many different materials, the ceramics, the brass, the stainless steel, and all that. And it really, it's hard to tell just a rule of thumb. You really just have to go out and look at them. That's what I found, is that you try to put rules on it, and there's always an exception to that. But you just go out and look at them again, look at those patterns, make sure there's not hard streaks or something like that coming down through the pattern, make sure that it looks even, make sure that the flow rates are even from one to the other. You really have to get out and maintain those things. It's really the only way to do it well.
All right. So Dr. Bradley, I had another question for you here. So what online resources are available that might help me make decisions about which fungicides are effective in managing which diseases, and what's the risk for Fusarium head blight in my fields this year?
Yeah, so there are some places you can go to get some good information about fungicide efficacy and what products work for which diseases. One of the things that comes to mind, there's a website called Crop Protection Network. Every year, and this goes for wheat and soybean and corn as well. Every year, plant pathologists like myself and across several states sort of get together and put together these efficacy guides. They're updated every year. The one for wheat just came out very recently. So you can go there and you can kind of just go across the diseases on the top and just kind of see how they're rated based on university trials. So that's one good place to go. And another good place you you asked about the risk of fusarium head blight this year. There's another website called wheatscab.psu.edu. PSU stands for Penn State. That's where it's run out of. But that is the fusarium head blight risk map, and that's based on weather conditions that are occurring. And I actually just looked at the map before I came on this morning, and it looks like there's some yellow areas in Kentucky, which means there's a medium risk for fusarium head blight, and there's just a few little red dots in there as well, which is high risk. So we have had really good weather for fusarium head blight recently. Once that crop starts to flower, like we talked about earlier, that Feast 10.5.1 stage, that's when it becomes susceptible to infection. And it's really susceptible all the way up through soft dough, but the sooner that it infects, the worse of a problem it will cause to the wheat grain. So far it's been pretty good risk. And I would say, thinking about the cost of the crop, we have our economists here, the cost of the crop, and the risk, I think it would be a good idea to think about protecting your wheat this year with a foliar fungicide.
All right. Well, we're going to get off talking about diseases for a little while and change to herbicides and weeds. Dr. Leglighter, I want to bring you in here. We have a question for you. What's the status of herbicide-resistant weeds on wheat in Kentucky?
Yeah, so as far as herbicide-resistant weeds, I mean, the one that really comes to the top of the list pretty much every year since I've been here has been annual ryegrass. So, and that's one that, I think is, I don't think I know is the biggest risk or threat to our wheat acreage as far as weed goes, and I could probably even argue as far as pest goes, but that's a different argument for a different day. But that's probably the one that comes top of mind. We know we've confirmed axial resistant or panoxidin resistant ryegrass, and right now we're in the middle of screening 22 different populations. We collected them last summer, so unfortunately those do take some time. It takes about a year to get through, and 22 samples is a lot. But we're hoping here in the next month or two to really have a better grip on that. But I do know, we're facing a lot of issues with ryegrass, and herbicides just really aren't really going to be in the future. We're going to have to rely on something different. And that's where we're looking at different things, such as the harvest weed seed destruction. So I've got a student working on that, and it's looking pretty promising as far as ryegrass being able to retain its seed and to be able to go through that combine. So she'll be doing that project again this year. And so that's something I think could be very beneficial for Kentucky wheat farmers. The question always just comes, where's the break-even point of being able to afford that piece of equipment?
I have a question for Dr. Villanueva. What are the risks of plant wheat earlier than the Hessian fly free dates in Kentucky?
So that's another good question. Haitian flies are not a problem right now, but if you plant early, that can be a serious issue, because that's in Kentucky, we plant wheat between October 15 for the southern part and October 4 for the northern part. So that's one issue. The other issue is that we can have serious issues with aphids. Aphids are, especially if your seeds are not insecticide treated, aphids can be infected with the barley yellow dwarf virus, and that can bring serious consequences, especially if this infection occurs in early planting stages of the plant.
All right. So, if we're going to be dealing with fungicides and herbicides, it's probably pretty important to know how accessible those are. We're hearing lots of issues, not just with chemicals, but with everything. It seems like there's supply issues, and it all pretty much relates back to COVID somehow. But Dr. Shockley, got a question for you here. So do you have any insight or anything to provide about what's going on with the accessibility of some of these key inputs of herbicides and fungicides?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the great question. Well, I can't predict the crystal ball, but like you mentioned, I think it all boils back to, from an economic perspective, supply and demand, right? We don't really have an increased demand issue, right? It's a decreased supply, and that boils back to both COVID. And so if you think about labor issues that we're seeing across the agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, and getting those workers back into those manufacturing plants and producing the product that you need. So there's a drop in supply, but also if you think about not only your physical chemicals, think about other things like the plastic containers that hold the product. I mean, we saw this happen early on in the food supply chain with eggs. That's why there was a lack of eggs getting shipped, because there wasn't any lack of containers to hold the eggs. So it doesn't matter what sector you're in, we're seeing shortages across the board. So I would recommend, if you haven't reached out to your input supplier yet, reach out, see what they're anticipating in the supply chain, get those inputs bought. Because if you didn't pre-purchase back in October, November, we went through some overstock supply, as we were talking, Carl, yesterday, and there's going to be shortages. I don't know where the next one is, but when you think about some of the COVID issues, and then also you had, if you remember what happened in Texas, that's often forgot, right? There was a gigantic ice storm in Texas, right? Which never gets ice. Shut down the power grid. Well, what happened to all that natural gas, right? It had to get diverted back to the homes to power, millions of people. And so when that goes, that usually goes into some agricultural inputs, right? You're going to have decreased supply. And so go out. I recommend you expect higher prices for inputs, right? Usually when crop prices go up, unfortunately, what happens with inputs shortly after? Well, you couple that with a COVID issue and a supply issue, you're going to see increase in input prices. So really managing and making sure that you're using some technologies on the engineering side to, spray where you want to spray, check out those chemicals, what's the best price you can get, and apply when you need it, where you need it. Because again, luckily we've got great prices in wheat to support some additional input and some additional protection. But again, it's accessibility, and so you're probably going to be paying more.
Daniel, if you want to handle the next one, I've got to text a supplier real quick here.
Well, just wanted to just remind everybody participating that we do have a question and answer section at the bottom, where if you click Q&A, you can type in any questions that you have, and we'll get them asked here to our panelists. So we still have a little time to do that. Do you all have any other questions for our panelists right now?
Yeah, I've got one. We'll shoot it back to Dr. Legleiter. Travis, are there any new chemicals available now? We talked about inputs and everything for resistant weeds in the wheat crop.
Yeah, so this is a question I get a lot, or I'll get questions where people will send me, hey, I heard about this new wheat herbicide, and for Kentucky, there's really not a lot. Tarzec is probably about the only one, and that's going to use halosulfuron, which is what's in QLEX plus PowerFlex. So it's just a new combination. Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of new wheat herbicides in Kentucky. There's lots of new ones out there, but most of those have 9-10 month plant back restrictions to soybeans. So that's where we usually get restricted on wheat herbicides. Is we get the plant back always holds us off of a lot of those products. I mean, you could apply them, but then you can't plant your soybeans, which most of us need to plant those soybeans. So for right now, there's really not a lot of new products out there for us, unfortunately.
Okay, so I have a question for Dr. Shockley, and it's sort of $1 million question if you really want to know the truth. There is a question, and it's not technically IPM, but I think it's a good question. It says, what is the outlook for wheat prices from now to harvest, and should a farmer be pricing 2022 wheat?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
As always, crystal ball.
Mhm.
I mean, I think when you're thinking about pricing any crop, right? I think it boils back to, let's first understand your cost of production, right? Understand what that break even is and what you need from a price. And I'm a conservative economist, and so I tend to not be greedy, and so locking in those prices that you can cover at least at least your variable costs, and then understanding your fixed costs and try to get above that, right? But looking at prices, they're very favorable. And I know a lot of our farmers have did lock in prices of other crops of the year, and those prices have gone skyrocketed. So there's some issues and concerns there about, well, if it's, you know, $7 wheat or $7.25, well, what about $8 wheat, $9 wheat, right? I mean, we're always thinking about the next step, but I would encourage you to understand what next year's costs are going to be. We've got tools to do that on our agricultural economics website. You know, get our download our wheat double crop bean budgets and put in some of our additional, you know, some of your costs, expected costs for next year, right? And get a, you know, rough estimate of what that projected break-even price may be for next year's crop. And, you know, it wouldn't hurt to start locking some in. Again, a portion of your crop, obviously not all of it, right? So start looking into that. I know a lot of our farmers look at not only contracting next year out, but even 2 years out. You know, I haven't looked that far out as far as carrying the market and to see what that looks like. If it's anything like some of the other crops, everything's being demanded right now. And so there's not that extreme carry that we normally see for holding and storing grain. But yeah, I mean, I would encourage it. I think, you know, above $7 wheat is really good, right? And you couple that in a double crop system with where our bean prices are right now, this year looks very favorable for wheat double crop bean production systems here in Kentucky. So I'm optimistic. I think it's going to be another good year for us.
Yeah, I guess on the 2022 side of it, the kind of the wild card there is, like we said, inputs. We don't know what they're going to do between now and then, and it's a little difficult to lock in inputs for 2022 for next year, right?
That's exactly right. So one thing you could do is, again, talk to your supplier, say, okay, is this going to be a long-term effect of these labor shortages that we're seeing and product shortages? And, you know, one thing you could do is just, we take our best guess, right? So you can take what your input cost was for this year, add 25% as your best guess, right? And go from there. And so you can utilize these tools in various ways and look at one of your key inputs. It may be seed, right, next year, and say, okay, what happens if I do have a 25 to 50% increase in my seed cost? What does that do to my break-even price needed? So you can use our tools online to adjust those inputs and see how those would then reflect the price needed. So I think, you know, going through those risk scenarios would be a good off-season experiment to do. So again, you can find those at our extension website on agecon at uky.edu.
So our question and answers have been a little more econ based here these last couple ones. So we got another.
So how will these high prices affect small local elevators, their ability to get financing to pay margin calls and farmers?
That is a difficult question. You know, I don't have a good answer for that one. I don't deal on the lending side of things, right? Obviously, if it was on the opposite side of lenders with farmers, right, we're getting great crop prices, and so that's a different animal. So I don't deal too much in that realm. I can definitely look into it and get back to you on that one, but that's a tough question. My apologies to whoever wrote that in.
All right, well, we can go on. We've got a question here, another one for Dr. Villanueva. Why is it necessary to scout wheat in both the winter and the spring?
So scouting is very important for IPM programs, and that's basically one of the most important facts of integrated pest management. You need to spray insects or pests when you have those in the field, without doing calendar-based sprays. So you need to spray because, especially early during the season, because if aphids are affecting the wheat, they can transmit the disease. Later on, you can do the spraying in spring. You can check for insects on the spring because aphids are going to come again, and then you can do a proper application of the insecticides. Later on, you can have armyworms or other insects that can affect your wheat. So you need to also be checking for those pests. I think that's the interesting part of integrated pest management. You shouldn't rely on calendar-based applications. And also early during the season, if you use insecticide-treated seeds, you don't need to do application of pesticides for aphids because the insecticide in the seeds are going to have probably 20-day period of effectiveness. So you can wait that period. So.
We've still got a few more minutes here left with our panelists, so I want to encourage everybody out there. If you have any questions, type them into the Q&A section. We'll be sure and get them answered here live on air. While we're waiting for some of those to come in, Dr. Bradley, I want to go back to you. Can you just give us a quick overview of any new research or what you're working on, and as far as wheat diseases here at the center?
So we kind of talked a little about some of the work that Tim and I have done with coverage, fungicides. So a lot of my work has been with fungicides. And one of the things that we're finding here recently, I have a graduate student that's working on this project, is some fungicide resistance issues. And so we spend a lot of time talking about Fusarium head blight, which is probably the most important disease of wheat here in the state. But we also have some foliar diseases that are important. We used to kind of call these Septoria leaf blotch. There's a couple of different diseases, pathogens that cause these diseases, and the symptoms look the same pretty much. Kind of hard to determine what it is in the field. But so this Septoria complex, I have a graduate student that's looking at fungicide resistance within those pathogens, and we are finding resistance to the strobilurin fungicides, which has been a pretty important class of chemistry for farmers here in Kentucky. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you're spraying fungicides to control some of these leaf diseases, that you're using products that contain multiple active ingredients from different chemistry classes, because we are finding resistance to some specific classes. So I would say that's probably the most important thing that we've sort of run into here in the last couple of years.
All right, we have one here, and I'll let whoever chime in. I think it might go to Travis, but we've seen a lot of tillering out here in this year's wheat crop. Should we be doing anything to control potential lodging? This may be more of a nitrogen management question later on, but any of you have any insight on that, or we can hold that to the next session as well. We're a little late as far as that goes, and a little late on any Palisade applications or growth regulators too. So
we're a little late on all that. So yeah, that might be to defer to the next group.
Yeah, we do have one for you
another
now.
question too that is specific to you. So it says control of yellow top weeds. They sprayed Qualex and it did not work. Any other options?
Yellow top weeds. So like crust leaf groundsel, is that?
That's what I would assume.
I would assume.
Yeah. So and they sprayed Qualex. So and at this point in time, I mean, we're really too far past for anything. But you know, the Qualex product should have been a good product, or any of the products that have growth regulators in them are going to be pretty effective. And really, for that weed, if we get a good burn down and just get a really well established wheat crop, it typically will outcompete that weed pretty easily. It's a weed that we can outcompete pretty easily with wheat as well. But unfortunately, this time of year for me, it's game over, unfortunately. So, and again, that's focusing in on the fall and thinking about next year in the fall. And I always encourage residual herbicides in wheat too. And those residual herbicides will help you out with all weeds. We talk about it for ryegrass, but it helps us out with all those weeds. So that's what I would do, is start thinking about next year.
While we're on that subject, what are maybe some of the actives that you see working really well in Kentucky on your residuals?
As far as residuals go, so if what we were dealing with, but if we're dealing with ryegrass, which is the one I always gravitate towards, it's the pyroxasulfone based products, so things like The like Zidua, Fierce, and Anthem. Those are going to be products that have pyroxasulfone in them, and they work really well. If you're not dealing with ryegrass, there's some others out there that are really going to help us out quite a bit as well. So, I think any residual is going to help us out quite a bit.
Again, we've got just a couple more minutes here. If you have any burning questions left, be sure to type those in.
While we're
Dr. Stumbaugh, I've got one for you. We don't talk a whole lot about aerial applications in wheat, but sometimes when we get into a wet season or whatever, we'll maybe throw that option out there. What do you see as far as coverage of aerial versus ground applications? Which one's better in a wheat crop?
And I'm not going to have a lot of good data to give you on that. In general, the aerial applications do a good job of coverage if they're put on correctly, just because of the nature of that kind of application. So it's an aircraft, whether it's a fixed wing or a helicopter type of an aircraft, there's a lot of air movement that's pushing that chemical down into the crop, and so you're getting that coverage all around. So the non-systemic type of fungicides and stuff like that are going to get coverage on all different parts of the plants, and so in general. But you got to make sure that obviously it's one that's labeled for that, and of course you're going to be hiring a service probably to do that, unless you're looking at some drones or something funny like that. But yeah, that's in general, and maybe Carl has some extra insight onto that as well.
Yeah, I think you talked about calibration earlier, Tim. That's really important for the aerial applicators too. It's so being sure everything's calibrated right. The other thing's label is also really important. There are actually some labels, at least used to, and I don't know if they're current. Again, read the label to be sure it's the current version. But there was actually, in some labels for fungicides, there was actually talking about using an increased amount of water volume. I think a minimum of 5 gallons per acre for some applications for Fusarium head blight control. So that's another thing to think about. If you're thinking about aerial, you may need to use a little bit more higher water volume than what some aerial applicators may be applying for like corn and soybeans.
All right. Well, it looks like that was all of our questions that we had submitted. So I think we're about done on time. So to our IPM panel, thank you all for joining us.
Yep.
I heard y'all mention earlier that you actually had to wear pants. You couldn't wear your basketball shorts for this one.
and your
So
crops, yeah.
sorry about that. You had to put your pants on today.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you all again for joining us. And Whitney, I think you have a poll to
I
to
do.
put up.
I have another poll for you guys too that are listening and on the webinar to fill out. And these are based on your production. So if you are a wheat farmer, then we would like for you to answer those questions. Or if you're an agent, how many do you cover in the county? So please do fill that out while we are getting ready to start with our next guest.
All right. So again, want to thank the panel. If any of you have any questions that come up later on, feel free to get in contact with them. It's pretty easy to find their emails or their office phone numbers or whatever, and get a hold of them. Be sure to ask those questions. They'd be willing to answer them.
And their Twitter handles are on the chat. if
Yep,
you
I think
need to
Chad
get
has
a hold
added
of them that
those
way.
in as
Yes.
well. So we're going to move into a couple of videos now. The first one we have is Dave Van Sanford, and he is with the wheat. He is with the wheat breeding program. So we will get that pulled up, and we'll also go into a video with Bill Bruning with the wheat variety trial program. Bill is going to be available for a short Q&A session at the end of his video. Dave Van Sanford was not available. So if you have any questions for him, be sure to get a hold of him later today or later in the week. But if you come up with any questions during Bill's video, be sure to write those down or submit them, and we'll get those asked.
Remember the Q&A session or question down on the bottom of your chat function. You can do that and do that at any time.
Morning, everybody. Dave Van Sanford here, University of Kentucky wheat breeder. I've shot a couple of videos from the field that I want to share with you, but first, let me just share a couple of PowerPoint slides, then we'll go to the field. Just to give you a sense of the size of our program, where we grow plots and so on. Our home farm is Spindletop Farm, north of Lexington. We also have plots in nearby Woodford County. Our largest nursery this year is down at Princeton, the West Kentucky Research and Education Center. And then finally on Walnut Grove Farms down near Shockoe in Logan County, Kentucky. On the order of 13,000 plots or so overall. But really, I wanted to, before we go out to the plots, I wanted to just refresh your memory where we spend a lot of our season. Basically, when we get done planting in the fall from to about this time of year is in the greenhouse, making crosses and creating populations, creating breeding lines. And eventually, with any luck, that leads to something like this. So this is our new variety, Pembroke 2021, which was released last fall to the Kentucky Small Grain Growers Association. This is a production field that this photo was taken last spring in Logan County. And this particular line has excellent scab resistance. It's got 3 scab resistant genes. It is early maturing, so you want to plant it on the late side. It stands well. And overall, we're very excited about it. It's the first beardless variety that we have released. I'll show you you'll see a couple of plots of it in the video, but nothing on this scale. So I wanted you to get a good look at it. And I really want to say a big thank you to the long-standing association that our program has had with the Kentucky Small Grain Growers Association, who've been very generous in their support for the breeding program, and also say thanks to Seymour Milling for their support. And so with that, I'm going to sign off now, and we'll take you to a couple of videos that I shot at Princeton and in our scab nursery at Lexington. The video quality wasn't great at Shockoe, so even though I refer to it, I'm not including it in what you'll see today. So thanks a lot for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you in person at the field day in 2022.
Look at our plots at Princeton. We've got about 3,000 plots planted here this year, mostly breeding line trials. Bill Bruning's wheat variety trial was planted here as well. We have a fungicide by variety trial. We have some collaborative nurseries where other breeders have entered lines that we test for them, and they test ours to give us diverse data from diverse environments, so it helps us make better decisions on which breeding lines to advance for possible release. So as you can see, as I home in on this plot, that we've got heads that are just slipping out of the boot. Basically, things are looking pretty good at this stage. We've had some sub-freezing temperatures that caused us some concern. But looking down in the canopy, I see a little septoria leaf spot. Didn't show up all that well because the wind's blowing this leaf around, but you see those kind of oval lesions on the leaf. This disease moves from the bottom of the plant up toward the head. So at this moment, we've got ideal temperatures. It's supposed to get up to low 80s today, but then cool back down to the 70s and even the 60s. So we should have some awesome weather for grain filling. And at this point, barring freeze damage, which does not seem to be super extensive, I think it's variable across the state, I think we're looking at the potential for a pretty good wheat crop. So basically I come here, make a trip around the state once a week to get heading notes at this stage. So I've just started taking heading notes today. I'll be back probably on the weekend and then maybe the middle of next week, so we can kind of get things caught up to where they should be. We see some early heading types, and of course we're interested in those because those are typically the ones that we're able to harvest earlier, and that's good information for the grower to have. So my plan is to show you these plots here, which I'm doing, and after I get done with heading notes here today, I'm going down to Shockoe. So we'll look at the plots there, and then we'll head back to Lexington and look at our scab nursery there. So with that, I'll sign off from Princeton right now and talk to you soon. Thanks. Okay, so it's the next day. We're back in north of Lexington at our home farm, and I'm walking into the scab nursery. And so basically what we have planted here is all of our breeding material, Bill Bruning's variety trial. We have some barley, some rye, and everything is planted in what we call head rows, these 4-foot long rows that are representative of all of our breeding material. And as you can see, the flag leaves are out, these things are in the boot. Some of the barley is headed over there, and some of the early ryes have already come out. So basically we try and screen everything in here by putting down some corn that's been inoculated with the scab fungus. I'll see if I can focus on some corn on the ground down here. And you can see there's a kernel of corn that's been inoculated with the scab fungus. And we wait until we see some black spots occurring. And those are the fruiting bodies that contain lots and lots of fungal spores. And those things are released typically in the middle of the night, and they infect the wheat heads during flowering. And so this allows us to create a disease epidemic, create a scab epidemic. And we often will get toxin levels of 50 parts per million in here, which is just nothing that you would ever see in a farmer's field. But this level of disease pressure allows us to screen very intensively, and anything that's super susceptible immediately shows up and we get rid of it from the program. And then the lines that we consider keepers that are promising, we'll go ahead and harvest each row with a sickle, and then we thresh the grain using a very low volume of air so we don't blow out the scabby kernels. And then we go into each grain sample and separate the scabby from the sound kernels to give us an estimate of fusarium damaged kernels. And then we recombine all those kernels and send the samples off to Minnesota for toxin analysis. So this is an activity that takes a lot of our time and effort, and we feel like it's paid off because our material is becoming more and more scab resistant. So I'm going to step out of the nursery now, and we're going to turn the mist irrigation on just to give you a sense of what that looks like. And we see that once the irrigation goes on, it forms a nice mist over the entire nursery. We have it scheduled to go off, as I said, in the middle of the night, which is the time that we know most of the spores are going to naturally be released anyway. And then we have typically one early morning application of the irrigation just before everybody gets here to begin work in the scab nursery. So we'll come into this material and start taking heading notes. Well, we've already started taking heading notes in the barley and the rye. And then typically 21 to 24 days after heading is when we come in to rate the heads for scab symptoms. And so you can see now some water is starting to shoot out of those nozzles. And pretty soon we should have a nice mist of water covering this whole scab nursery. And this combination of inoculated grain and this mist irrigation creates ideal conditions for the disease to take off. And so we see the mist starting now. It's a windy day once again out here at the farm, and I'm kind of stepping back because it's spraying my way, but we put our spreader row of an old variety 2555 that is very susceptible to scab. We put it on the far western side over here of the scab nursery, where we have our one set of misters, and then we have it planted throughout the nursery as well. And so we use it as a barometer to tell us what kind of a level of infection we have. So that's probably more than you wanted to know about how we do scab resistance research, but I'll call it good there and talk to you guys soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thanks for that video from Dave Van Sanford. I believe his contact info was there at the end, and I think Chad is also going to type that into the chat so that you'll have it if you have any questions for Dave. We're going to roll in now into a video from Bill Bruning, and of course, Bill is with the wheat variety trial program, and I know that's always a popular stop here at the field day is to check out his wheat variety trials. So we'll have this, and then Bill will be on for some questions. If you have any of them come up, go on, type them in the Q&A. We can ask them, and he'll be on here with us.
Coordinator of the UK Small Grain Variety Testing Program. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we're doing this year and talk about some work we're doing with evaluating varieties for cover crop potential. So this year we have 7 wheat variety tests that we're looking, evaluating varieties primarily for grain production. These tests, we're looking at grain yield, test weight, plant height, heading date, and lodging potential. The 7 locations these tests are at are Fulton County, Christian, Logan, Caldwell, Webster, Woodford, and Lexington. Additionally, at one location, we're continuing our work with the wheat forage trial, where we're cutting at approximately the milk stage for those interested in looking at varietal differences in forage production. Also continuing our work evaluating these varieties for straw yield potential. And we will be rating these for diseases, not anything showing up right now, but whatever disease is prevalent in Kentucky this year that we can rate, we will go ahead and get a thorough set of ratings on that particular disease. If you don't see a particular disease that you're interested in, you can look at previous year's variety trial data, and often you will find varietal information on different pathogens such as stripe rust or something less common than the usual septoria and head scab that we typically see every year. Besides the wheat trials, we also do a few smaller scale size trials. The first being the barley variety trial. There we're looking at, of course, your traditional barley lines. Now we also denote within that test which of those are malting barley varieties, as well as hulless barley varieties. Our cereal rye trial, looking at the varietal difference there, but we're also looking at where you can see the differences between hybrid rye versus your traditional rye. And we also have a triticale trial. Again, we're looking at the different yield potentials, all the agronomic characteristics we look in our wheat trials, we look at for all of these different trials here. The cereal rye trial and the triticale trial, we also have cover crop ratings as well, or estimates of the percentage of ground cover in the winter. Continuing our work with the spelt variety trial. Spelt is an ancient hulled wheat and regaining some popularity in specialty markets, and people with gluten insensitivities to wheat are able to tolerate spelt. So looking at that as well. And then finally, continuing our work with our oat variety trial. There, of course, like all these, you're primarily interested in yield, but here, really when selecting oat varieties, you want to look at the winter survival data that we collect annually, because often there is a dramatic difference. And that's the main thing affecting our yields here in Kentucky is, does it survive? But the one thing I wanted to bring your attention today is our cover crop trial, evaluating all the varieties that are submitted to our trial for cover cropping potential. And this data is published in our forage variety trial test. And I put it in a forage test because this data can also be used as an estimate of winter grazing potential. But so much of our annual wheat acreage is planted into cover crop or for forage production. So it falls pretty well together here. But you can see that there are large differences in the percentage of canopy cover taken. I believe these were taken in February of 2020. We've already finished taking our ratings for this year. But you can see last year that the range in percentage canopy cover range from 19 to 39%. So you're talking double the percentage of biomass you have there during the winter. Gives you a good idea of what type of protection you're getting from various sources of erosion. So just wanted to bring that to your attention, let you know where you can find it in our variety test bulletin. And you can also find whether your head types are bearded or awnless here as well. So a lot of different information mixed throughout this variety report. And if you have any questions, I'm very easy to get a hold of throughout the year about any of these trials, and also be available to answer any questions here shortly. Thank you.
All right, so we have a few questions here for Dr. Bruning. The first question we have is, how much of Kentucky's annual wheat crop is planted for cover crop?
Well, thanks. That's an interesting question because really about 20 to 25% of our crop, and so many times when we think about our wheat crop, we only think about acres harvested, but there is clearly a substantial portion of our crop that is planted is harvested for forages or utilized as a cover crop. And that's a couple of the reasons why I went ahead and developed these tests to look at varietal differences in either forage yield potential or now, as of recently, really looking at the cover crop potential for these varieties. So, and as we can see, there are dramatic differences in both these categories. So when selecting varieties to plant, just browsing at this data, even if you're just saving seed to replant as a cover crop, and your goal is really to protect your soils, as well as to scavenge residual nitrogen and things. Really, these simple decisions, many times there's high yielding varieties that can help you fit these profiles that could be either high forage yielding as well, or good for cover cropping too. So, but yeah, 20 to 25% of our acreage is utilized for these other purposes.
Okay. I have one other question here for you. Is it okay to use bearded varieties for forage when cut at the boot stage?
So when cutting at the boost stage, that's a little bit earlier than when most people harvest wheat for forage in Kentucky. Typically, you're going to get a higher protein crop, higher quality, often used for dairy production. When you do harvest later at the soft dough stage, there's a lot more fiber in those awns, and that creates palatability problems where the cattle might prefer not to eat that if it's has an uncomfortable situation while they eat. It can also cause health problems as those awns mature. So we generally do not recommend using bearded varieties for forage production. However, when harvesting at the boot stage, because there is such little fiber accumulation at that stage of development, it is probably perfectly fine to use either beardless, smooth-headed varieties or an awned or bearded variety when cutting at boot stage as well.
All right, well, that looks like all the questions that we had. So if you all need to get in contact with Dr. Bruning, I think his contact info is in the chat. And thank you for your time today, Dr. Bruning. All right, well, now we're going to kick it over to our soils session. We've got several extension soil specialists here today with us, Dr. Josh McGrath, Dr. Edwin Ritchie, and Dr. John Grove. And then we've got an economist that stuck around for another session. We've got, just couldn't get rid of him, Dr. Shockley. So which one of you all want to lead off? We got some questions.
And I just want to say y'all are off the hook on the lodging question because Carrie swooped in and saved the day and answered that in the chat with her insight there. So you're welcome. My first question, we'll start off with Dr. Grove, and this is the age-old question of sulfur. What's the latest update on the need of sulfur in wheat production in Kentucky?
Seeing a little bit more sulfur deficiency. Edwin and I have viewed a couple situations that turned out to be sulfur. They're small, they're not prevalent. There is a project that I have funded from the Kentucky Small Grain Growers to look at sulfur nutrition more broadly. We had 9 locations last year, and we have 10 locations this year. In essence, last year's results were somewhat damaged by the frost that we had, but the Overall impact was that we had, out of 9 locations, we had 5 that did not give a response either way. We had 2, however, that gave a negative response to sulfur. So we need to understand that there may be situations where sulfur is actually going to be harmful. And then we had 2 locations where we got a positive response. So the sulfur situation is somewhat mixed, but we are looking at it to try to get more information. One thing I would say is that soil testing for sulfur is not a good diagnostic tool, at least at this point, although we're like everybody else, we're taking soil samples. And the tissue testing is probably the better way to go. The problem with that is a lot of our tissue samples are taken too late to be diagnostic for this year's wheat crop.
What are you looking for in a tissue sample, John?
Well, I'm looking at the absolute level of sulfur in the tissue as well as the nitrogen sulfur ratio, because both of those elements are important to amino acid and protein development.
Are you looking for like 13-to-1, 15-to-1 on the NS?
On the research side, I'm waiting to see what the results show me. I'm not entirely convinced that the existing literature is where I want to be, but certainly that's what the current literature suggests.
Where would you expect to see all this sulfur deficiencies if they're going to arise?
That's a loaded question from you, Dr. Ritchie. You and I've been going to the same fields, and basically where we've seen it has been primarily to the west of here in the Purchase, or in the west edge of the Pennyroyal region. We've seen it on occasion, but it seems to be associated with areas that have lost topsoil, either due to erosion, or in one case, it looked like where they cleared the trees out and left nothing else behind in terms of topsoil, or where there's this expectation that the organic matter level is relatively low and won't deliver enough sulfur to the crop, and where the subsoil is not really capable of holding on to sulfate. In the Pennyroyal region itself, a lot of the subsoils, the red subsoils underneath the Criders and the Pembrokes, have enough anion exchange capacity. They hold on to sulfate better, and it's rarer by far to see a deficiency in these soils.
We had a comment come in here in the chat from Mr. Tom Miller. It says almost all of his areas are now grown out and green again. So you all must have been in Ballard County at some time looking at something.
Well, we've been to Ballard County. That was actually a couple years back, but recently we've run into problems in Marshall County and here on the west edge of Caldwell too.
Seen it back east when you like you said, your eroded side slopes and cool wet spring. Sometimes it'll grow out, sometimes it won't.
Right.
But yeah. So what's the economic threshold then, Jordan? so let's say that it's not consistent, right? Like sulfur is like nitrogen, it's not consistent, right? And so if 1 out of 10 sites needs it and there's no diagnostic way to tell when it's going to hit, and it's, you know, can be, then how do you make that decision from an economic standpoint?
Price of sulfur, right? And so is it a cheap insurance policy, or is it an expensive insurance policy? And if you can pencil it out as a cheap insurance policy, you know, if it's 1 out of 10, how bad is that one?
Right. That's another factor.
Right. Is it, you know, 50 bushel, or is it 5 bushel?
Right.
Right. And so you just look at, you know, 1/10 of the expectation of yield loss and price.
And now you add the 1/10 in where it could be a negative impact to put on sulfur. And that has to be factored in as a probability statement as well.
Exactly. And so I think all that needs to come into play, and I haven't penciled it out,
right.
But you know, you got to think about both of those aspects. But I mean, I would look at it as insurance, right?
Well, and those of you listening, please use the Q&A chat if you've got questions. We still would like to get some of those in, but I do have one, and this one is for Edwin. So what are some of the biggest misnomers in wheat production related to soil management and fertility management, or fertility management?
I'm going to go with the second part, I believe,
okay.
And just fertility management as a whole. it's hard to grow a crop, a legume crop without nitrogen. But then you get into your P and your K, and hey, how much do we need to put down? Do we need to put down based on how much we think that crop's going to remove? How much that crop removes? Is it related to what our soil test P or K levels are? So it's been, I've heard this several times. I'm just going to use simple, straight up, easy numbers. But if I have a soil test P of 50 pounds per acre, and then I remove 0.5 pounds of P2O5 per bushel, and I have 100 bushel yield, what does that mean? Does that mean at the end of the season, my soil test P is going to be 0 because I just removed 50 pounds and I have 50 pounds? No, it doesn't mean that at all. That soil test P is an index. So that is based on the soil test extractant that's used. We use Malic 3 here in Kentucky, and a lot of the surrounding states do. And then that removal is, that's absolute value as well. We're removing that many pounds, but that soil test P is saying at this point in time with this extractant, we have this much that's going to be available for crop growth. So we don't usually use a removal basis because you have mineralogy coming into play. Okay, we take some out of the equation, well, some more dissolves from that primary material and comes into solution. Josh had a good slide that I used a few years back, and it shows an iceberg, and you see the top of the iceberg, and a little bit of the iceberg melts, but you don't know how much is below that ocean. So that's what we have to work with. So that's why it's kind of tough. It's a tough way to go, or maybe not the most economically advantageous way to go to say, I'm going to base it on removal. If I'm in the central bluegrass and I have a test P of 300, your great grandchildren can probably grow tobacco, corn, soybeans, whatever they want to, and then still grow a wheat crop and still have plenty of P, even though they've removed, thousands of pounds over time. So I think understanding what the units are, how they come back into play with your soil fertility recommendations. Our recommendations are based on correlation and calibration response trials. So we have a pretty good idea if you're at this soil test level, you might need to add this or you're good to go. So any of you soil fertility people want to throw something in on that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's right. You gotta go with the soil test. It's the first thing with P and K.
And it's a cheap
it's
tool.
cheap insurance. It's not perfect, but it's the best nag in the glue factory, so it's it's going to do pretty good. And then we tend to get a little bit hung up on the micronutrients and micronutrients. Soil test is one part of the equation. We've got to use soil test, but soil test, because it's so hard to find responsive sites, we don't have a lot of good soil test recommendations for micros. So with micros, I tend to lean towards a more holistic approach. What's the soil pH? What's more organic matter? What's the temperature and moisture been? What is the crop rotation? What was the last crop like? You've got to start thinking about everything, not just soil tests, when you move into the secondary and micros. Same for sulfur that we were talking about before. You're starting to bring other pieces of information in other than just soil tests.
I do think the most important piece of information to bring in when you get to the secondaries and micros is plant tissue analysis. If you don't trust your soil test, and there's good reasons not to always trust soil tests when you're on secondaries and micros, you want to have a plant tissue analysis. Now, it is true that you can say, well, I'm taking it a little bit late for the current crop, but the current crop can be a canary in the coal mine for the next crop. For example, soybean is an excellent crop to sample ahead of corn for things like boron and zinc. Soybean doesn't respond very well, by the way, to those micronutrients, even when they're modestly low, in a field where corn will give a response. We've seen this several times in Russell County and work that Greg Schwab and I were doing there. So I think plant tissue analysis becomes relatively more important and more helpful to you when you're in micronutrients and secondary macronutrients.
And I want to come back to something you said about Russell County. Copper, you know, we have several people that I get this question every year. Well, I've got this much copper in my soil test. How much should I add? Well, we haven't done the correlation to calibration studies, and that field that he's talking about, I think, is the only field in west of the Mississippi that has seen, east of the Mississippi that's had a copper response on a mineral soil. So pretty good chance that you're not going to be seeing a lot of copper responses. And even if you did, we don't know how much copper to tell you to add based on how much copper they found.
And stuff like copper, you can knock the heck out of a crop if you apply too much.
Too much of a good thing is not a good thing.
You know, a couple years back, some of the YouTube experts were just, all they were talking about was copper, and that stuff worries me a little bit. I mean, I wouldn't waste my money on it. I'd save all that money and use it for more soil sampling.
All right. Well, since the economist hung around, I've got a question for him here. We talked a little bit in the first panelist session about rising input prices. I know you've done a lot of work with economics of using manures as fertilizer sources. We still have a pretty strong source of poultry litter here in the state of Kentucky. What are some of the economic factors you want to look at if we're looking at using some of these manures to try and combat high commercial fertilizer prices?
Good question. I think it depends on the situation you're in, right? So are you a poultry farmer and a grain farmer, right? Or are you selling it or are you buying it, right? So I think there's a dynamics involved with that. But you know, when we look at the economics of poultry litter, it really just correlates to, or should, right, the value of commercial NP and K, right? That's what you're comparing it to, and that nutrient content of that poultry litter, right? So for me, if I'm selling it, right, I would want to take a sample. We're talking about soil sampling, right? Make sure you take a sample of the poultry litter and use that as a marketing tool to say, hey, this is, you know, 50, 50, 50, or it's 60, 60, 60, right? I mean, the variation in poultry litter is actually pretty substantial depending on clean out methods. And so that impacts the value directly. You know, here, you know, it's usually, you know, we get the question, okay, what's poultry litter going for these days? And it's 25, 30 bucks a ton. And then you add $10 to apply it, right? And so, but when nitrogen is going up in value, right, here in the past couple months and skyrocketed, so technically has the value of poultry litter, right? And so if you have houses and are using it, you're in a good spot, right? Compared to when prices were, you know, 20 cents per unit of NP and K, you know, just, you know, a year or two ago, right? And so it really fluctuates, but it's a complete fertilizer, right? And so what I always recommend is going back to soil test, understand if you need it, right? Because if you don't need the P, don't need the K, nitrogen gets really expensive if that's the only thing you're using or benefiting out of the litter. Yes, you got your micronutrients and everything like that, but so understand if you need it, because obviously there's economic and environmental issues with that, and then base it on those soil test results of P and K, right? Don't base it on the nitrogen map, because you always could come back and do some supplemental nitrogen. And so it's great, right? It's a valuable asset to have right now. And I don't think prices, if I'm selling it, are adjusting accordingly. And so if you do have excess poultry manure that you're trying to get rid of, you know, look at the market prices. And we've got tools available on our Ag Econ website to value poultry litter. And so go check those out when you get a chance.
Some of the guys that use it may want you to say that a little quieter next time. Did the rest of you have anything else to look at from a soil fertility standpoint?
I just got a question about this week before last from a farmer called me, and
And the thing about nitrogen, I mean, a lot of people applying poultry litter, the soil test says they don't need any P&K. And so I just bought some liquid, some 32% last week. And I think I was a little over 40 cents a pound for nitrogen, not just doing the math in my head. So let's say 40 cents a pound, and let's say you got 30 pounds per ton of nitrogen, right? So was that $12 a ton that it's worth, right? And so because the P&K is worthless to you if your soil test is above optimum. And then remember, so you said it varies with house management and clean out, but it also varies with what you're doing in the field, because if I put that litter down in the fall, it has zero value to me because I'm not getting that nitrogen this year. There might be some carryover, but I'm not going to put any stock in that. So I've just paid to spread something that is worthless because I didn't need the P&K and I put it down in the fall, so I didn't get any nitrogen. I just wasted my time and money. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is I got a question. Well, I'm going to spread 2 tons an acre. What's the best way to get a sample? Personally, for me, if you're going to spread 2 tons an acre, and then what you're trying to do is figure out after the fact how much nitrogen you put down so you can side dress the balance of what you need. I set a 5-gallon bucket at the pile and grab a handful out of the middle of the pile, not that cake on the top, every time I take a load onto the spreader, right? And then by the end of the day, I've got a couple buckets that are really thoroughly mixed, sample, mix them up, send that off the lab, and I know what I applied. That's the easiest way to do it. And if you want to know how much you put down, put some pans out in the field. As you're spreading, spread across the pans, use what you collected there to have analyzed, and you also get how many tons per acre you put down. So you got both ends of it, and you can dial in that side dress nitrogen through the corn.
I think economically too, a lot of the people I talk to that use it, they don't think they're getting as much nitrogen as reported, and a lot of them just totally discount the nitrogen. So, you know,
they applied it.
It might be. I mean, but if you're spring applying it in front of a crop, you know, you should get 30 to 50% out. If you're incorporating it, you know, a little bit more than that. And I mean, there's value there.
I have a question there. When we're looking at these reports, if you send it to a UK lab to have the analysis ran on it, are those numbers what you should go by? Are they automatically accounting that there's only 30 to 50% of the nitrogen, or do you need
number you look at? So they give you pounds per ton in one column, and then they give you like a 324 or something in the next. So that other one accounts for, I believe, 50% nitrogen availability, and then 80% phosphorus availability, and 100% potassium. And based on some stuff I've done and multiple conversations Josh and I have, that phosphorus is probably closer to 100% as well. So that's something need to just get updated.
And honestly, the UK lab's method of looking at nitrogen, I did a bunch of research on this, and Edwin's just wrapped up some research on this. UK takes 50% of the total nitrogen and says that's what you got. But a lot of places take 50% of the organic nitrogen and then add on top of that the ammonia nitrogen, and it makes a difference. So actually, UK lab, if it says you've got a 40 pounds per ton of nitrogen, I actually think it's a little higher than that. I think you're probably getting closer to 50 pounds per ton. The UK actually, I think, plays it on the conservative side. In other words, we're not going to tell you have more than you have. We're going to tell you less than you have, and you're getting a little extra kick. So that's our soil test lab, in my opinion. Our manure testing program is underestimating the nitrogen. If we say 40, it might be closer to 50. So if you're managing it right, you shouldn't be coming up short.
But that's something you'd probably need to keep in mind if you're using it ahead of a wheat crop to make sure you don't get in trouble with your nitrogen management later on, right?
Yeah. Well, and so with fall applied litter in front of wheat, you're going to get organic mineralization in spring, so it's good in that regard. But it's kind of, I think poultry litter has more value in that corn crop. That's where I'm going to spend my money because it's expensive to spread, and I'm gonna put it down on the corn because I just think with wheat it's a little bit dicier for because of exactly what you brought up because of that uncertainty.
You can put too much nitrogen on corn and probably not hurt yourself. Wheat's a different critter.
We used to spread a lot of litter on wheat in the spring. We used to do a lot of that, and you don't see that hardly at all anymore just because of the value.
All right. Does anybody have anything else burning that they're working on that you'd like to share with the group before we wrap up for the day here? What are some things you all are?
I think one of the hot topics that I'm seeing is carbon markets, right? And how how does that play? What's going on? What prices? Is it an opportunity for Kentucky farmers? You know, and is there opportunities for Kentucky producers to do it? I think there's a lot of questions that need to be asked, and things need to be figured out. We are when you think about these carbon markets, a lot of them are establishing themselves right now as additionality, meaning you need to do practices that you haven't done before. And a lot of those carbon markets that are being touted right now are focusing on no-till and cover crops. And obviously we are the home of no-till. So thinking about some of these questions and these opportunities, if you're interested, let your local county agent know, because I will probably be doing a winter programming on carbon markets, ins and outs, and challenges to that. So look for that potentially this winter.
All right. So I think Whitney's pulling a poll question up here. While she's getting that pulled up, I'll just say, if you are interested in hearing some more about the carbon credit talk, Jordan doesn't know this yet, but I think we're going to hit him up to do an episode here in a few weeks on the Dirt to Dollars podcast to talk about that. So be on the lookout for that, and we'll be able to get you some more information that way. So Whitney, I think you have the poll question up now.
I sure do. I have the poll question up. And in the meantime, while we're filling out those polls, we do want to thank our partners in this wheat talk today, and that's Seymour Milling Company, the Kentucky Small Grain Growers Association, and H&R AgriPower. They are integral in the research and development and doing the different things that go on in our wheat research here and across the state. So we appreciate their support.
All right. And along the same lines, we want to thank you all for participating. I think I saw as high as like 58 participants there at one time. So really pleased with the turnout today. If you want to catch some of the highlights a little later on, I'll plug our show again real quick. We're going to play just kind of a highlight episode from today's event in our show this week. So look for that later in the week, into the weekend. Daniel, where can they find us if they're looking for Dirt to Dollars podcast?
Yeah, so if you're looking for the Dirt to Dollars podcast, you can do this real easy Google search or whatever search engine you prefer, and type in Dirt to Dollars podcast, and it's the first thing that comes up. It's found anywhere that you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and just about any of them that you can think of, it's there. And also, if you're around the Hardin or LaRue County areas, it plays on Saturday mornings at 8:05 on Abe 93.7.
And I want to go off script just a little bit here towards the end. One person, or a couple people we didn't include in our thank yous. We need to thank Colette Laurent. She put a whole lot of work into this and setting this up, and it was foreign to all of us, and we just kind of sat back and did what Colette said. And also want to thank Brian Voland with Ag Communications. He's been here running the tech support and turning switches and turning knobs and everything else, helping everything go well. And we've really had to be on the fly as we've kind of adjusted as things went on. So thank you to you too.
Thank you very much.
Wouldn't have been possible without you.
Yep. All right.
All right. Well, I guess that's it.
Yeah. Well, I guess we usually say see you next week, but I don't guess we'll see them next week. But we do appreciate you guys, and we hope you guys enjoyed the wheat talk today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you guys.
Stay safe.
Thanks.
Yep.